Okay. Welcome everybody to a special class 4 of the Practical Tanya, but we had the class 4 of our series, the World Purpose series. This is based on chapter 37 in Tanya, which we've been doing for a while now. These past 2 chapters happen to have been extremely essential ideas, and very excited to be able to explore some big ideas. So I'm going to pull up a little bit of a, let me just pull up a screen. And Practical Tanya, present, and then we're going to go. Okay. So this is a very short review of how we got here, because this ends a 4-part series. So we're going to talk about tonight charity and Torah study. Each one, these are 2 mitzvahs, and yet each of them is the most important mitzvah in Judaism. This is class 4 of the series, and let's have a quick review. Class 1 of our series was the Tanya, the world purpose and our role in it. I want to make I'm a lifelong student of Tanya, meaning I've learned it for many, many years, and only in the past 5 years or so, when I've gotten the opportunity to teach it, it forced me to delve in it deeper and pull up some commentaries. Just yesterday, on the recommendation of a friend, I got a new book by yet another author on the Tanya called Winning Every Moment, Soul Conversations with the Writer of the Tanya. This is an academic in Israel who researched it. And I'm just in the beginning of it. He had some very interesting, he had one very interesting line about the history of the Tanya. And he compared it to another great scholastic feat in Jewish history, which was Maimonides codifying the Talmud. You see, Jewish law was originally given orally, and it was studied in the academies. And then eventually, before they were driven into the Roman exile, it was written down in the Mishnah and the Mishnah and the the Talmud. But it wasn't so orderly. The Jewish law, the how to be Jewish. It was all in conversations that were transcripts. So you could have a transcript and there was some sequence, but it wasn't by the topic. So if you wanted to learn the laws of Shabbos, you had to go to a rabbi who was proficient in the entire body of the Talmud and knew and could sort of cross-reference and give you your ruling. Maimonides basically took every topic and went through the entire Talmud and all the commentaries and figured out what would be the ruling in this law of Shabbos, or in this chapter, in this topic of Shabbos. And he basically restructured the whole Jewish law, which was all scattered, and he structured it very well. That was what Maimonides did, and that's why it says, in his tombstone, it's written, from Moshe till Moshe, there was no one like Moshe. Because what he did was no one did, for thousands of years. So this author, this academic in Israel, writes about the Rabbi Shneur Zalman. He did the same thing for Jewish mysticism and the deeper dimension of Jewish philosophy. It was very scattered. It was in the Zohar. It was in this book. It wasn't written necessarily in a topical way. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Tanya, which he says back then was a major bestseller. Imagine if Princeton, publishing company, Princeton University Publishing Company, put out a book. I don't think they'd print 20,000 copies of an academic book. Yet Rabbi Shneur Zalman, in 1790 something, he printed thousands of copies, which is huge back then. And it was a bestseller because what he did for Jewish mysticism, he put in a very good structure. And he also made it very relevant to the average reader. So what we're studying now is just 2 chapters. It was chapter 36, and we did over three of the 3 last classes, chapter 37, fundamental ideas, which he culled from all over Jewish philosophy. And he wrote into 2 neat chapters. So just to tell you a little bit of how special this is. So in chapter 36, which was our class 1, the world's purpose and our role in it was as follows. Very, very short. You can go to YouTube if you want to hear the full class on the Chabad Pittsford YouTube channel. We explained that God originally was everywhere. There was no other reality outside of God. Just God's light was infinite. God chose to want to create something outside of God. So he created a world, or more correctly, he created many worlds, because when you get from a oneness of God where there's no room for anything else, he wanted to go in stages where, okay, the first dimension or reality outside of God was like where God dimmed his presence, so to speak. God dimmed his presence, so to speak. So it was still a very spiritual world, and it felt a sense of I'm a world, but I know that I'm only I'm a flow. I'm an extension of God. And then the next world, God dimmed it a little more, where it also knew its source, but it wasn't as shining or as luminous, realizing how God's, the life force of it. But it still realized that God's the life force, just not as much as the world before. The next world dimmed it even more. And dimmed every world, many worlds. It breaks down to 4 worlds in Kabbalah. But the last world is the physical world, our world, where God dimmed it, your phone, he dimmed the brightness to totally black, where God's presence is not felt. Where you can't see in the physical world, you can't see the life force that we're coming from. You can be aware of it. There's philosophical proofs of God's existence, but it's not, immediately tangible how this pencil is really coming from spiritual energy that comes from God, and that's its life force. So that's, Then you have class 2 explained the mechanics. Was how does everybody's, I'm sorry, one more thing. In class 1, we said how at the end of the day, God chose of all the worlds, this is the world where God's purpose is to be found. Why? Because God chose that we, with our free choice, us citizens of darkness, we also have free choice to make light out of that darkness. We can start to undo the filter or the blocking of God's light. We can choose by doing Torah and Mitzvahs with reality to bring extra light from the darkness. And that's the whole purpose. God made a whole system of dimming the lights till there's total darkness of his existence, that we can break it, and there's that special quality of the extra light that comes from the darkness. Okay, that was chapter 36. That is the purpose of the world. That's, if you know that, you're doing pretty good. The purpose of the world, according to Tanya, calling from Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah, is the whole purpose of existence, period, of heaven, of angels, of spirituality. It's all because there should be a physical world where we can bring light from the darkness. We can bring God's presence even when it's hard to do and to show that, yet we do. There's an extra quality of light from darkness. Any questions? Feel free to ask. Okay, so in order class 2 review was start to explain mechanics. How does it work? How does a mitzvah actually make light from the darkness? So explain like this. Everything in this world is either neutral, initially it's either neutral or forbidden. Either it's something, an activity, or a thing for a Jew that is a forbidden activity or a forbidden thing, or it's like 90% of the world, it's just neutral. A cow, is that forbidden? No, it's neutral. If you want to use it for kosher meat, you have to slaughter it and prepare in a certain way, and then you can eat it. Fine. And even when you eat it, is that a mitzvah? No, it's just to give yourself, the vitamins or the energy to continue surviving. Life itself is neutral. Meaning it's neutral compared to holiness, I'm saying. And how is that? How could a cow or a human being or our bodies or water or whatever, how could all these things be neutral? Don't they all come from God? Aren't they all holy by mere fact they're extensions of God's energy? And the answer is that is true, but God puts everything through what we call another filter. Besides the dimming, there's another filter in this world that everything comes through, and that is called klipa, which is called in Kabbalah the shell. Everything comes from a shell that hides the divine energy inside of it. And there's two types of shells, of filters of everything, of each thing, that depends of what this thing's category is. If it's something that's forbidden, that means it came through a shell or through a filter that blocks the holiness to the point that it is, at least for the human being, irredeemable, or for the Jew, for more things than a non-Jew, but this thing is irredeemable in certain activity with it. Not irredeemable, it's irredeemable in certain engagement. So a pig, there's nothing wrong with a pig. Wilbur from Charlotte's Web is very cute. Pigs can be cute, but doesn't mean they're holy. And not only that, for the Jew, they are forbidden to eat. And even if you're going to eat it for whatever reason, for any good reason, other than saving a life, you are not given permission to redeem that spark because it is in a shell of total impurity. Okay. But then there's most things in the world that come through the shell or the filter of the klipas noga, the shining filter, that it's the translucent. It's a shell. It covers over it. So you don't feel the holiness, at least initially, but it's translucent in the sense you see that I could do a certain activity with this thing, with the energy of this thing, that can bring out its holiness. And that is when we take a cow and we slaughter it, and we eat it to have energy to go lead a productive life and do mitzvahs. We took that energy and we actually utilized the translucent klipa shell. We basically diverted it to obvious holiness, God's will. And that's every mitzvah is. Every mitzvah is a connection of basically you're re-diverting something that is coming from a shell of neutralizing its holiness, and you're bringing out in an obvious way how no, in spite of a translucent shell around it, it actually is for God's will, and it's meant for a godly purpose. And every mitzvah, you think about it, that's what you're doing. You're taking money, it's charity. We'll talk charity more, but if we start with charity, the money is neutral. It's not holy, it's not unholy. If you go use it to give charity, you took it. It was something that was, again, covered by a translucent shell, and you utilized it for obvious holiness, God's will. You take a lulav and an esrog, a palm branch, and a particular type of citron, and you specifically put them together, as the Torah says, to take 4 species and shake them as a lulav, shake them on sukkahs. You took vegetation and you utilized it for obvious holiness. Every mitzvah is diverting it. Okay. Is diverting something that's neutral and being repurposing it is a better word. It's repurposing something that's neutral for that thing to be used out for obvious open holiness. In other words, God's will. Okay. So now, that was class 2. Class 3 was just the steps of how this works, and very, very short. The stages of how a mitzvah, again, I could just tell you a mitzvah is pixie dust. It just magically makes things light. But the Tanya is very methodical. It doesn't want to just believe me. Here's the logic behind it. So I explained to you the general logic. You're repurposing something that is neutral for obvious holiness, that the mitzvah is using it for God's will. But even more so, the Tanya goes in more explains it step by step. For example, when you take let's say, I don't know, you cook a meal for Shabbos, to have a Shabbos meal. Having a Shabbos meal is a mitzvah. Okay, so the food is now being, that food, let's take the chicken, is being utilized for a mitzvah. But even more so, there's a second thing that's happening. Here's the ripple effect. It's not just the chicken is now being used. Your body and the drive, the animal soul, the energy behind it, which is also coming from that neutral force of translucent shell around it, keeping it neutral in its initial stage. Your body is also neutral, but now you're eating it. So the body is engaging, your body's also being shiny. So now it's like touch point 1 is the chicken, and touch point 2, it happens to touch a person's body, which is bringing the body for that moment, for that activity, being used for holiness. But even more so, and it mentions, by the way, that any mitzvah there's some mitzvahs that are not, seemingly not physical mitzvahs, like Torah study, it's a mind thing. And prayer, isn't that more of like a heart thing? But it's interesting enough that all the mitzvahs, even like prayer and Torah study, they have a physical component to them, and that is your verbalization of them. That's why when you say the Birchat Hamazon or you pray, you have to verbalize it, because again, the goal of mitzvahs is to transform the physical reality. So you're doing a mitzvah prayer, doing a mitzvah Torah study. You don't just want to keep it at brain activity. You want to keep it, you want to make sure it's also touching the physical body, hence you verbalize it. Brachas have to be verbalized, and so on. Okay. Ripple effect number 3. Number 3, your body, right, to be able to prepare the food, right, and to have money to buy the food, that your body had to go, didn't just like arrive there. It had to eat and drink the day before and the day before that. And it had to earn money to have money to buy the chicken to make the Shabbos food. So that, all that stuff also is elevated by this later act. Retroactively, you're showing your whole physical existence of the whole week, let's say, was also ultimately bringing you to this point of Shabbos. So the whole week's activity of your exercising and eating and whatever, also at some level is now being utilized in the bigger scheme for the final mitzvah on Shabbos. And other mitzvahs, not just Shabbos, any mitzvah. There's a back end. There's a backstory to how you got there. That backstory is also now being elevated to holiness. And we went even further. Ripple effect number 4. A Jew is, it says there's a 600,000 root souls, and those root souls have root souls. Every Jew has a soul that's meant to be in a certain part of the physical world. And that's why we end up where we end. It says that's why, how do we, we're meant to be where we are to be. Because not just for us to have our hero story or whatever, it's where we end up. We're supposed to bring that locale by our trying to make a mitzvah life. It comes with us. So in Rochester, the supermarket that enables Shabbos meals is Wegmans, and the Wegmans ends up also being elevated because you shop for Shabbos there. If you lived in Houston, Texas, it would be Albertsons or something like that. And Albertsons is the one that's coming along for the ride. Maybe you could say that's why Wegmans spiritually doesn't want to let Whole Foods in, because spiritually they know they don't want to give up that zchut, that merit, to be helping Jewish people have Shabbos and bring mitzvahs and bring the world to redemption. Side joke, maybe. Think about it. As Mike Myers says, talk amongst yourselves. Okay, anyways. So that's a huge ripple effect. So when we do a mitzvah, it's not only about we're going to go utilize the pencil to go write a nice note to someone, an elderly person who needs a pick-me-up, but we're going to actually use the pencil, and we're going to, and you have the body is going to come along, and the body had food for breakfast and lunch and supper that had to come along, and it had to get the pencil from a store, and we had to, and our whole job we lived, and our whole locale is coming along with it because it was our supporting cast. So that's how one mitzvah redeems a lot of world. And interesting today, the global world, we mentioned last week, there's no such thing as just like you get food from your local. It's coming from all over. So when you're buying food, in order to have a happy family life, in order to live a good life and to do your mission, do your mitzvahs in this world, then you're actually elevating Ecuador and mangoes from Brazil, from Belim, whatever it is. It's a global world. Everything. Where's your suit? Where's your clothes from? Your clothes that's housing the body that's able to lead the mitzvahs. Where's that from? It's from Vietnam. It's from China. It's from wherever. The whole world is a supporting cast. Is waiting for the Jewish people to utilize it for mitzvahs, and also for and also to I would say as well the non-Jewish world to do their mitzvahs, because they have 7 mitzvahs also, which is again why Torah puts the human being at the central role of creation, because you can have a beautiful, beautiful world filled with exquisite beauty, but it doesn't have animals and rocks and vegetation and landscape and nature scenery. Doesn't have the consciousness to be utilized in of itself for a mitzvah godly purpose. It needs a human being to do that. And we explained how it all interconnects through what we spoke about just till now. That's pretty big ideas there. So we're going to go on to the next slide. Okay. So class 4 is tonight's class, the final class of the series. And we'll hopefully do another series the next few chapters of Tanya. So stay tuned for that. Why charity and Torah study are the most important mitzvahs. Now, we know there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. They're all meant to transform and reveal the godly purpose waiting to shine in reality. Every mitzvah does that. But some mitzvahs make that happen in a larger way. So I'd like to, if you have the book, we're in chapter 37, section 5, page 423, if you haven't had the Practical Tanya book. He writes there, he quotes a very famous quote. The famous quote is, based on the above, we can appreciate why the sages praised the virtue of charity in a very great extent. In the Talmud, it says, charity is equivalent to all the other mitzvahs put together. I didn't have time to put the quotes on the board, but charity is equivalent to all the mitzvahs together. There are a few mitzvahs in the Talmud where they say this mitzvah is equivalent to all other mitzvahs. Now, it's not like, okay, I'll just give charity and then I'm good because I did the equivalent of all the other mitzvahs. It means in a certain sense. But based on what we said till now, it actually makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense of how that happens. Think about it. Well, I'd like to hear from you. Why do you here think that charity would be such an important mitzvah? The Talmud says it's equivalent. Anybody want to share why? Why do you think charity would be that? So you might think of some answers like charity is the easiest mitzvah, but it's not really the easiest. It's very hard. It can be very hard. Maybe it's something that everybody can do no matter what your knowledge of Judaism is. It brings peace to the world when there's charitable giving. But what were we talking about till now? We're talking about till now that every mitzvah, when it does it, it's basically utilizing the energy and the food and everything. It's utilizing it for God's will. When you give charity, it's not just the $100 you give to charity or the $1 you give to charity. That's just the representation. What are you actually giving when you give charity? You're giving your blood and sweat. You're giving you're getting up early to get ready to go to work. You're giving your financial security. I mean, a little bit of it. Some more than others. And the point is, you invest when a person works for money, you're investing your mind, your body, and your heart. You really put yourself into your job for whatever reason, different reasons, to have enough food to eat, to feel career worthy, whatever it is. People put themselves into their job more than they do into their hobbies because of necessity. They definitely spend a lot more time in their job and thinking about their job than they do their hobbies because of, again, of necessity. And the money is the result of that investing of self. And every dollar you give, you're basically taking your investment equity and putting it into a mitzvah. You took your entire animal soul and you really gave it over to a higher purpose. And therefore, all the energy, it's not just the dollar, it's all the energy and the worry and the thinking and the training, all of that you gave away to a mitzvah. Wow. That's a big gift to God. The dollar is the least of it. But what made the dollar come, you're really giving a serious donation of yourself, a real carbon, a real offering of yourself. Which is, by the way, in the temple times, they would give the carbon, the offering, as a way of getting close to God, because the animal represented the animal soul, and it cost money, and it was a way to, bring it to God as a sort of representation. After the temple was destroyed, we don't have the carbon. And in a large sense, money became the replacement. Charity became the replacement because you're giving a large part of yourself. And it says even further, let's say you won the lottery or you inherited a windfall, so you don't have to work. So now when you give charity, maybe you could say that person isn't really giving, it's not as valuable because they're not giving that much sweat equity. So he says, no, even that's considered a huge gift of the animal soul. You want to know why? Because you could have bought yourself some self-gratification with that, in all the inheritance money, a way nicer car, or an even nicer car, or an even nicer vacation, or even a nicer whatever whim the person has. You could have done that, and you said, no, I'm going to give this for a noble cause, for a godly cause. And therefore, you gave of yourself. Which is also another famous line in the Talmud, and the Rebbe quoted it a lot. The Rebbe quoted certain sayings a lot. Was Gedoyla Tzedakah Shemekreves Segula. It says, greatest charity, for charity hastens the redemption. We explained before that the Jews are all over the world. We're the sort of, we don't even know it ourselves. We're this secret elders of Zion, but in a good way, that we're meant to be spiritually over the world in order to raise the world to our acts and be the leaders in that, of making every part of the world realize its godly potential. And charity, that's the whole purpose of all the mitzvahs. And charity does it a lot. Charity does it more so than, for example, blowing the shofar. The shofar is a very important mitzvah. It's a very powerful mitzvah. But at the same time, it only accesses one element of your being, your hearing. Maybe it takes it stirs emotion, but it doesn't engage every part of your essence. But charity does, because it took a lot of essence to make the money, to create the money through the job. And that's why giving charity hastens the redemption, more so than any other mitzvah. As an aside, I want to point out that for those of you that know that in Chabad, the Rebbe was, it's hard to understand. Imagine Rashi or Maimonides. These people, but Maimonides had a unfathomable schedule. He had to be the Sultan's physician and then treat the poor in medicine, and he had to study, and he had to be the rabbi. He didn't have a minute to himself. The Rebbe, had a lot on his plate, not just global issues, but he answered thousands of letters, hundreds of thousands of letters in his life, tens of thousands of letters in his life with his secretariat for people's personal problems. He had a lot on his mind. And yet the Rebbe made himself accessible specifically through helping people have the opportunity to give charity. That he would give kids throughout. He'd always give kids dimes and coins when he'd be on his way to synagogue to encourage them to give charity. And later on in 1986 till his stroke in 92, every Sunday when anybody wanted to meet him, you'd come meet him for a few seconds to get $1 and become his agent to go give charity. Why did he do that? Was it just like a gimmick? No, the Rebbe was the embodiment of Tanya in our times. Out of all the mitzvahs, and he was like, do all the mitzvahs, but if we got to pick one that's going to make Mashiach, the redemption, come quicker, it's going to be charity. It's one that's it's accessible and doable for everybody. Another thing the Rebbe said. So obviously, every house should have a charity box. This is a directive. Every house should have a charity box, but not only have a charity box, that you should actually mount even a small charity box. Mount a small charity box in your kitchen, because it should become part of the physical attachment of the home, not just movable, but it should become affixed to the home. And many people remember the UJA had those tin charity boxes, and you can put on the wall. But they have small ones you can get from all over. It's this idea that should really, it's not just like a nice thing. It's like, this is what we are all about. Which is probably why subliminally Jews are such big philanthropists, even to non-Jewish causes. They don't even know why. This could be the spiritual underpinning of why that is. The deep conscious of Mark Zuckerberg and others. Okay, so that is enough about super mitzvah number 1, charity. But we'll talk about another super mitzvah. It also says in the Talmud that the study of Torah is equivalent to all the mitzvahs also. Torah study is also equivalent. But isn't that a contradiction? You just told me charity and what that represents is really the embodiment of all the mitzvahs. Why is Torah study also called equal to all the mitzvahs? So the answer is like this. I'm just reading this for 1 second. So there's a couple reasons why Torah study is so important. Number one is that your animal soul, meaning the energy of the body, we call the animal soul, that has not just physical expression. There's more spiritual expressions of your animal soul, which again has to be transformed also. meaning repurposed for mitzvah, mitzvah drive. What is that? It has thought, it has speech, two other garments, two other expressions. So Torah is very good to help those garments of the animal soul be utilized in a godly way. You can't you give charity all day long, your mind doesn't have to be engaged in that very deeply. And the deep part of your mind can really only be properly repurposed, so to speak, if it's for a godly purpose through intense study of Torah or in speech. So therefore, Torah study is equal in the sense of it's the best mitzvah for transforming the intellectual properties of the body and of the animal soul. And yet there's another reason. Another reason is that what makes a human being priceless? They say a orangutan has 98% the same DNA as the human being. And yet, I think we would agree that a human being's life is more priceless than an orangutan's. Meaning, by Harambe the gorilla, the zookeeper, acting on human instinct, had to choose, took out the gorilla. It wasn't pleasant to save a child's life. And the answer is that even, let's say, the DNA is so similar, so physically there isn't that much of a difference, but the mind of the person is infinitely greater and more complex. Greater self-consciousness and morality is only in the human mind compared to an orangutan. Not to say they don't have elements of it, but not nearly on the level of the human mind. And therefore, the mind, we can agree, compared to all other parts of the body, is what makes us most human or special, the special quality of a human being. So, therefore, Torah study is a mitzvah of the mind, meaning it's a spiritual mind mitzvah. Meaning even not just in the human mind, but even in God's, we say God reflects the way the human being is. We're creating God's image. So it says God has this, we have limbs, God has mitzvahs. Those are God's limbs. Those are God's expression of will. Just like we move our arm by will, God's expression of will is the mitzvahs. Well, the mitzvahs are like the limbs, and the Torah study is like the mind. It's at a different level of importance in that sense. Of course, you might say Torah study, the way we study it, is very mundane. We talk about, stories or law, common law. Yeah, but that's that. We spoke earlier. That's God sort of packaging the Torah is really spiritual wisdom in the cosmos, and God packages it in stories, even though there's stories that happen, or Jewish law, as a physical representation of that divine, spiritual, otherworldly wisdom. So still, we know there's a famous thing. If you have, there's a mitzvah that only you can do. Let's say mitzvah, an important mitzvah, time-oriented mitzvah that only you could do. Like let's say helping an old lady that really needs help, and only you can do it. The mitzvah outweighs your obligation to study Torah. Because Why? Why, if you had to pick between, you got to do Torah study all the time. And mitzvahs, sometimes you have to do them. And when you have to do the mitzvahs, the mitzvah outweighs the Torah study. Why? Because the Torah is representing God's mind. It's a whole different level compared to the limb, limb mitzvah. And the answer is, the reason is that's true. The Torah is a greater potency of divine will. It's more mind representative versus action oriented. But what's the goal of this all? Why do we have a mind? Why do we have a body? Ultimately, it's about transforming the physical. So when it comes to a physical mitzvah, an action-oriented mitzvah, and study that only you can do, by the way. I mean, if someone else can do it, you should probably, your Torah study would take primacy. But if only you can do it, action versus study, action's going to outweigh that, because the ultimate goal is transformation of the action of the physical world. Torah study is more of a, in a sense, it's more of a means for the ultimate goal of physical transformation. But in the event that, at the end of the day, when you study Torah, there's still something very, very special. It's a representation of God's mind light, which is, is a greater revelation. Torah basically is greater spiritual revelation, but physical mitzvahs are a greater market share. You're getting to a further physical realm, and that's a greater accomplishment, ultimately. It speaks about when we say, we call Torah, Koreh Torah. You read the Torah. I mean, sometimes it means literally, reading the Torah for a synagogue, but even just reading Torah. Reading also in Hebrew is Koreh. Koreh can mean also call. You could be reading Torah at the same time you're calling God to you, because you're calling a very potent, high-level mind embodiment of God's will. And that is a very important thing. So therefore, Tanya ends off sort of, explaining why charity is a better representation of the ultimate purpose. And that's, the end it comes down to physical, and charity is the best depiction of that. A physical transformation and everything that transformed along with the giving of the money. Not what you're going to do with the money, just the mere giving of the money. It's not that the money is going to do great things. Even before that, the fact that you gave the money, you caused a huge amount of spiritual transformation. And that's end game. But Torah study is a more spiritual revelation. Granted, it's not the ultimate end game. It's more of it's one aspect of it. Sometimes it may be a means to the end game of action transformation, but it's an important. First of all, we have to transform all parts of ourselves. One is our thought. That's a big part of who we are. You can't say I just do mitzvahs and I read other philosophy. Your mind is also an arena for transformation. You got to transform it. So Torah does that. But it's also, it's a very, what makes humanity so special is the mind, and therefore Torah is the way of that special human capability, how it gets directed for God. And of course, that pours over to everything else. The more you know, the more you do better. The more you're studying God's will and all the nuances and so on, your action is going to be at a much higher level also. So when they said Torah study is equal to all their mitzvahs, it's probably in the sense of you can't do the other mitzvahs Meaning, there's two reasons. One, just practically, you can't do mitzvahs if you don't know what to do. That doesn't mean that's an essential reason why Torah is greater. As the Talmud says, Torah is equal to all the mitzvahs. The reason it's equal to mitzvahs essentially is because it has that special mind connection to God's mind, so to speak, which is a very unique, high spiritual, potent revelation. Okay, that ends chapter 37 and our series. Any questions? Love to hear. It's a lot to digest. Isn't each letter of Torah study considered mitzvah and charity one mitzvah? I'm not sure. You could say every charity is broken down to pennies, and it's all the time that went into it is down to the second. So I don't know, it's very hard to put a quantitative, depiction. Anybody else? Okay. So that's pretty much it. I hope this gives you all a new vigor of that. Everything you do, it's not just one thing. There's a lot being schlepped along with that in a good way. And, that's why every day when you have opportunities to make the right choices and do mitzvahs, it's not just that moment, it's all the moments that came before that. I can say your parents, meaning your upbringing, so much goes into one action. And at the end of the day, we have free will. So we always will have that choice. But every mitzvah is making a huge, as explained logically in chapter 37 in Tanya, we logically explain how every mitzvah transforms in a very rational way so much of the person's energy and the person's surroundings. And practically, if you want to start to do something practical, it's going to get something practical. You can't just talk about it. We could be, wow, today's Lamar from the Tanya. Make a point to give a coin to charity every single day. For that alone, Dayenu. Have a great night, everybody. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Yes, bye-bye.